The frame freezes. Stephen Miller leans forward, lips curled into a smug half-smile, clutching his stack of neatly prepared notes like they are weapons. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sits. Upright, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, not rattled, not rushed, just waiting. It is the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind of silence that tells you something unforgettable is about to unfold. And then the voice cuts in. Stephen Miller thought he could outsmart Jasmine Crockett. Instead, he walked straight into a trap built out of his own arrogance. The room feels tense the way a courtroom does just before a verdict is read. Miller's confidence is dripping off every gesture. He's been here before, wielding talking points, statistics bent to his will, and a rehearsed sneer designed to belittle anyone who dares to challenge him. To his supporters, he's the architect of the sharp line, the master of control. But what he does know, what he can't see, is that this time, his opponent is someone who has spent her entire life standing firm against men who mistake arrogance for strength. Crockett does not flinch, she does not rush to interrupt, she lets him carry on, piling his words, layering his assumptions, digging himself deeper with each phrase, and in that stillness, in that patience, a story is about to reveal itself, a story not just of one exchange but of the battle between two visions of America. The question hangs in the air: can Miller's brand of dismissive elitism crush someone who embodies the grit of lived experience, the voice of communities silenced for too long? His smirk says yes, but the calm in Crockett's eyes says otherwise. The moment lingers, the cameras capture it, viewers lean closer. What happens in the next few breaths will not just be remembered as a takedown, it will be remembered as a reckoning. But here's the thing, this clash didn't begin in that instant. The trap didn't spring out of nowhere. To understand how Stephen Miller, the man who built a career on controlling the narrative, ended up silenced, you need to know the road that led him here. And that journey starts long before the cameras began to roll. To understand why this moment shook Washington, we need to step back and see the man who thought he could never be outmaneuvered. Stephen Miller didn't just walk into the room with papers in his hand, he carried a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. For years he had been known as the icy architect of Trump immigration policies, the mastermind behind speeches that dripped with division, the strategist who sharpened words into weapons. His name alone evoked images of families torn apart at borders, of cruelty masquerading as law, of intellectual arguments crafted to give prejudice a polished veneer. To his critics, he wasn't simply a political operative, he was the embodiment of the old playbook: control the narrative, dominate the stage, silence the opposition. And on this day, Stephen Miller was ready to do it again. His tactic was as predictable as it was effective: overwhelm with intellect, bury with jargon, and wield arrogance like armor. He did need to shout, his sneer was loud enough. The intimidation was built into the cadence of his sentences, the calculated pauses that suggested superiority, the tone that told opponents they were already beneath him. For years it worked. He could unnerve politicians twice his age, send reporters scrambling, and dictate the terms of every debate. But across from him now sat someone different, Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman who had built her reputation not by avoiding confrontation but by walking straight into it, a woman from Texas who understood what it meant to be underestimated, interrupted, talked over, and dismissed. She had seen the smirks, the dismissive gestures, the condescension that came from men who thought credentials equaled character, and every time she chose not to shrink, but to stand taller. This wasn't just about policy, it wasn't just about who could deliver the sharpest line or the cleverest soundbite. The stakes in this confrontation were layered, deeper than the cameras could capture. At the heart of it was representation, the right for voices like Crockett's to exist and be respected in the halls of power. It was about identity, the struggle of those long silenced, finally demanding to be heard, and it was about moral authority, the idea that facts without conscience are empty, and intellect without humanity is nothing but manipulation. Miller thought he could lean on his reputation, that his pedigree and past victories would shield him, but what he miscalculated was the terrain he was stepping onto. Crockett wasn't a politician playing for applause lines. She was a lawyer and activist, a woman who had carved her way into spaces designed to keep her out, and she understood something Miller never would. That intimidation only works if you let it. The room may have been filled with the weight of Miller's history, but Crockett brought with her a different kind of force, one born not of arrogance but of resilience. For every time she had been interrupted, she learned to sharpen her clarity. For every time she had been underestimated, she found strength in proving them wrong, and for every attempt to silence her, she turned silence into fuel. Miller believed this would be just another sparring match he could dominate, but what he did realize was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for men like him her entire life. But what Miller didn't know was that Crockett had faced silencing tactics her entire career, and she was ready. Before the freeze-frame moment, before the smirk and the papers clutched in hand, there was the long shadow of Stephen Miller's career. To understand why this clash carried such weight, you have to know who Miller was, and why so many viewed him as the very embodiment of cold, calculated arrogance in American politics. Born in California and polished by the corridors of the Ivy League, Miller built his identity around being the contrarian voice in any room. At Duke University, he was infamous for incendiary columns railing against multiculturalism and immigrant rights, sharpening the edge of a worldview that would later define his political life. He thrived on provocation, on being the loudest voice of dissent against inclusion, on wrapping divisive rhetoric in the veneer of intellectual debate. From there, his trajectory only climbed higher. He became a Senate aide working under Jeff Sessions, where his obsession with immigration took full form. He didn't just study the issue, he weaponized it, turning policy into a battlefield where compassion was treated as weakness. Then came the defining chapter, Miller as senior policy advisor in Donald Trump's White House. Inside those walls, he wasn't just a speechwriter, he was an architect. The travel bans, the family separations, the zero-tolerance policies that tore children from their parents. Miller's fingerprints were all over them. He was the man behind the curtain, crafting the words that turned prejudice into presidential policy. And he carried himself accordingly. Miller's style wasn't bombastic in the way Trump was, no. Miller was colder, sharper, more precise. Where others shouted, he sneered. Where others stumbled, he spoke with the polished cadence of someone who believed he was the smartest man in the room. His rhetorical style was clinical, his arguments dressed in the language of logic, but underneath lay a dismissiveness that dripped with disdain. He didn't just want to win debates, he wanted to diminish his opponents, to make them feel small, to reduce them to footnotes beneath his carefully constructed superiority. But with that reputation came controversy, scandals that revealed the cruelty at the core of his politics, the family separation policy that shocked the world, the chance of send her back at rallies that echoed his fingerprints, his behind-the-scenes push for immigration restrictions so draconian they even alarmed some within his own administration. Time and again, Miller showed that control wasn't just his strategy, it was his obsession. Every phrase, every policy, every move was about dominance. And yet that very obsession became the hallmark of his public image. To his critics, he wasn't a policy genius, he was a zealot. A man so consumed with control that he lost sight of humanity. Man who mistook cruelty for strength and arrogance for intellect. That's why his presence in any room carried weight. He didn't need to shout. The mere mention of his name conjured the memory of cages, bans, and bans cloaked as security. For those who opposed him, Miller represented something larger than himself. He was the living symbol of elitism weaponized against the vulnerable. And this is the version of Stephen Miller who walked into the confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, a man convinced that his Ivy League polish, his White House pedigree, and his reputation for being untouchable would be more than enough to put her in her place. To him, it was just another chance to showcase his intellect, another stage to display his superiority. But arrogance has a way of blinding. Miller was so used to being the one who dictated the Terms, the one who silenced others with a smirk that he couldn't imagine someone would not only stand their ground but turn his own tactics against him. He mistook Crockett's calm for weakness, he mistook her patience for hesitation. What he didn't realize was that he had finally met someone who wasn't intimidated by cold logic. Without compassion, who wasn't silenced by arrogance in a suit, someone who could expose the hollowness beneath the veneer. Stephen Miller came into the room armed with every tool he had ever used to dominate others. Yet the very tools Miller relied on to dominate others would unravel against Crockett. To understand why this clash mattered, not just as a political spectacle but as a cultural moment, you need to know Jasmine Crockett, because Crockett didn't walk into that room with the armor of privilege or the insulation of old power. She carried something stronger, a life defined by resilience, sharpened in the face of those who doubted her, dismissed her, and tried to silence her. Her story began in Texas, where she grew up in a community that knew both hardship and strength. Unlike Stephen Miller's polished ascent through Ivy League corridors, Crockett's journey was one of grit. She didn't inherit a seat at the table, she fought for it, scraped for it, demanded it through persistence and conviction. Before she was a congresswoman, she was an attorney, and not just any attorney. Crockett made her name defending those most often crushed by the system, people who couldn't afford high-powered lawyers, people whose voices were smothered before they ever reached a courtroom. She worked as a public defender, standing beside clients the world wanted to forget. That wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of job that landed headlines or cable news interviews, but it built something in her, a deep belief that dignity belongs to everyone, no matter how loudly society says otherwise. Again and again, Crockett found herself underestimated. In courtrooms, older male attorneys brushed her off, judges interrupted her mid-sentence, colleagues assumed she would shrink under pressure, but each time she responded not with anger or surrender, but with persistence. She stayed steady, kept her ground, and forced them to reckon with her substance. That same persistence bled into her activism. In Texas, she became a voice for communities long ignored by power, whether it was fighting for voting rights, demanding accountability from law enforcement, or pushing for fair housing. Crockett carried the struggles of her neighbors with her. For her, politics wasn't performance, it was service rooted in the conviction that justice isn't charity but a right. And she knew something Miller didn't: the weight of being dismissed not because of your arguments but because of who you are. As a black woman in politics, Crockett understood silencing tactics not as an occasional inconvenience but as a daily reality. The raised eyebrows when she spoke with authority, the interruptions when she made her point too clearly, the subtle suggestions that she was too emotional or too inexperienced. Each dismissal carved resilience into her, each interruption taught her patience, each condescending smile steeled her resolve. She learned that dignity wasn't given, it was asserted, and she carried that lesson into every chamber, every hearing, every confrontation. When she entered Congress, Crockett didn't soften her edges, she sharpened them. She became known as a voice unwilling to bow to intimidation. She wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, to cut through political theater, to hold her ground against those who built their careers on arrogance. Yet her power wasn't in shouting louder, it was in standing firm, unshaken in the middle of the storm. Her philosophy was simple but profound. Politics at its best is about service. It isn't about who can flex the sharpest intellect or the highest pedigree. It's about who can stand up for people who don't have a microphone. She carried the weight of her community with her every time she stepped up to speak, and that made her dangerous to someone like Stephen Miller. Because Miller was used to opponents who played by his rules, who tried to out-argue him on his turf, but Crockett wasn't playing his game. She came from a different battlefield, one where arrogance didn't win cases and condescension didn't silence truth. She knew the quiet strength of patience, she knew the power of timing, and she knew that sometimes the best counterpunch wasn't fury, it was composure. And so when the moment came, when Miller tried to corner her with smug intellect, Crockett leaned on the same resilience that had carried her through every battle before. The air in the chamber was taut, charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Cameras clicked, pens scratched across notepads, and every eye turned toward the table where Stephen Miller leaned forward, his stack of neatly arranged papers spread before him like weapons. He adjusted them with deliberate precision, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then he struck. "Congresswoman," Miller began, his voice clipped, rapid fire laced with condescension, "isn't it true that your party has failed to present a coherent border policy, yes or no?" Before Crockett could even open her mouth, he cut in again. "Simple question, don't dodge. Yes or no?" The first interruption landed like the crack of a starter pistol. The game had begun. Crockett raised her eyes from her notes, calm, unflinching. She inhaled as if weighing the oxygen in the room, but before she could respond, Miller pounced again. "Answer directly, that's what the American people deserve, yes or no?" The second interruption came sharper, designed to destabilize, to rattle her rhythm. The smirk deepened across Miller's face. He thought he had found her weakness, cut her off, speed up the tempo, make her stumble. But Crockett didn't stumble. She stayed steady, her lips pressed together, waiting. Miller pressed on, his voice swelling with self-assurance. "Or are you suggesting that open borders are acceptable? Is that what you're saying?" The third interruption, a chorus of murmurs rippled through the chamber. Reporters' heads jerked upward, Crockett's supporters clenched fists under the table. They knew this tactic: bully the witness, steal the mic, force submission. Still, Crockett's silence wasn't weakness, it was timing. She sat with her hands folded, her face unmoved, as if daring him to keep going. And he did. "Do you deny the crime surge? Do you deny the failure of your policies?" Miller's voice was now quick, almost staccato. Interruption 4. The sound of a heartbeat, imagined or real, seemed to echo through the chamber. A steady thump-thump beneath the rising tension. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as though listening not to him, but to the weight of the moment building. Miller, sensing he was in control, doubled down. "The American people demand accountability. Do you even care about their safety?" Interruption 5, his voice, louder now, carried a showman's bravado. He was no longer just asking questions, he was performing, feeding the cameras, confident that Crockett had no chance to break free. But then came interruption 6. Miller slammed the papers with his palm, leaning across the table with theatrical precision. "Yes or no, Congresswoman? Stop dodging, yes or no?" The room bristled, some gasped, some shook their heads. Crockett remained seated, composed, her gaze locked on him like steel. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't raised her hand. She was waiting for something. And in that silence, in that stillness, the imbalance of power began to flicker. For the first time, Miller's confidence was teetering on overexposure. He was speaking too fast, too loud, pushing too hard. By his sixth attempt, Miller thought he had her cornered. He thought his relentless pace had left her no oxygen, no space, no chance to recover. But his seventh push would change everything. For 6 interruptions, Stephen Miller had dictated the tempo, fast, cutting, unrelenting. But when he leaned in for his 7th strike, his words sharp and triumphant, the chamber shifted. The energy snapped, as if the weight of his arrogance had finally overextended itself. And that's when Jasmine Crockett moved. She leaned forward slightly, not hurried, not rattled, but deliberate. Her hands stayed folded, her voice low but clear enough to pierce the din like a bell cutting through fog. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone controlled, "I'll answer your question when you give me the courtesy of finishing a sentence without being cut off." Gasps darted through the room, small, sharp intakes of breath. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. No shouting, no theatrics, just a calm assertion of dignity reclaiming the ground he had tried to bulldoze. Miller's smirk twitched just slightly, but he masked it with a shuffle of papers. "I'm simply asking direct questions." But Crockett didn't flinch. "And I'm giving you direct answers, but here's the difference: I won't be bullied into yes or no traps designed for soundbites. I'm here for the truth, not your performance." A ripple of murmurs spread, the chamber shifted. For the first time, Miller wasn't dictating the rhythm, Crockett was. She continued, steady as stone. "You want to talk about safety, let's talk about the children. Ripped from their parents at the border because of policies you crafted, you want to talk about accountability. Let's talk about the billions spent on cages instead of schools. You want to talk about caring for Americans. Let's talk about the dreamers, our doctors, teachers, and soldiers who live every day under the threat of deportation because of your obsession with control. The smirk was gone now. Miller's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the cameras, then back to her. He shuffled his papers again, a nervous tick betraying the unraveling beneath the polished mask. Crockett's voice didn't waver. Each word landed with surgical precision, calm and cutting at the same time. You see, Mr. Miller, bluster may win you headlines, interruptions may silence voices for a moment, but dignity outlasts arrogance every single time. The chamber stilled. Even the scribbling pens had paused, as if the weight of her words demanded silence. Miller tried to interject, but she raised her hand just slightly, just enough, and the room obeyed. He froze, caught in the web of authority she now commanded. I didn't come here to trade insults or to indulge in your condescension, Crockett said, her eyes fixed on him. I came here to represent the people who don't get invited to these tables. The single mother working 2 jobs while you cut her health care, the immigrant child who studies by flashlight because her parents can't afford the bills, the families who wonder why a government that's supposed to protect them feels more interested in tearing them apart. Her voice softened, not in weakness but in reach, pulling the entire room closer. And let me tell you this, they are not statistics, they are not props for your arguments, they are human beings, and I will not let you erase their dignity with interruptions and smirks. The silence was deafening. Miller's papers trembled slightly in his hands. His trademark smirk had dissolved into something else, tight lips, darting eyes, the faintest twitch of unease. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her point delivered not with volume but with composure, and then in a final deliberate move she said, You asked for yes or no answers. Here's one. Yes, I believe in truth, and no, I will not be silenced. The chamber erupted. Gasps gave way to applause, restrained at first, then swelling as if the room itself needed to exhale the tension Miller had forced into it. Reporters whispered, staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks, and even some of Miller's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Miller, meanwhile, sat frozen. His fingers fumbled with the papers, his usual armor of intellect and intimidation suddenly paper-thin. The smirk was gone, the silence around him was no longer control, it was exposure. For Crockett, it wasn't just a mic drop moment, it was a reclamation. Every interruption he had thrown at her became irrelevant, undone by a reply anchored in clarity, in dignity, in truth. The contrast was undeniable, Miller's aggression frantic and smug, collapsing under the weight of Crockett's calm. Her stillness had outmaneuvered his noise, her precision had dismantled his performance. And as the applause swelled, as the murmurs turned into momentum, the message became clear, not just to Miller, not just to the room, but to the nation watching. Arrogance had been silenced and dignity had spoken. But the real battle was just beginning, because the fallout spread far beyond that room. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished her calm, cutting words, the chamber seemed to exhale. But outside those walls the world inhaled and then roared. Within minutes, clips of Miller's silence and Crockett's steady reply shot across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The hashtags lit up like fireworks. Crockett crushes Miller, dignity wins, truth over smug. The edits came fast. One viral meme showed Miller's smirk dissolving into stunned silence with the caption, When arrogance meets facts. Another looped Crockett's final line, Yes, I believe in truth, and no, I will not be silenced, set against cinematic music, the kind you'd expect in a movie trailer. Millions clicked, shared, and cheered. Progressive commentators hailed it as a generational moment. One influencer wrote, This wasn't just a clapback, this was history in real time. Journalists framed it as a turning point, where the intellectual architect of Trump's hardline policies finally met his rhetorical match. Late-night comedians had a field day, their monologues filled with Miller memes, Crockett's name on every punchline. But it wasn't just entertainment, it was empowerment. young organizers shared the clip as proof. That standing firm against condescension and intimidation could work. Teachers played it in classrooms as an example of composure under pressure. Community leaders cited it as a lesson in how to turn calm truth into power. Politicians chimed in too. Allies praised Crockett for her poise, calling her the voice of conscience America needs. Even some who rarely weighed in on committee sparring admit privately that Miller had been outmaneuvered in a way they hadn't seen before. The silence he was forced into became symbolic, a visual metaphor of arrogance collapsing under dignity. The ripple effects weren't just digital. In coffee shops, at dinner tables, in office hallways, people were talking about that moment. The clip played on repeat on cable news, each outlet dissecting it with slow-motion replays and expert commentary. Body language analysts noted Miller's twitch, the tightening of his jaw, the loss of control. Contrast that with Crockett's unshaken gaze, and the story wrote itself. For her supporters, it wasn't simply vindication, it was personal. For every person who had been interrupted, dismissed, or talked over, Crockett's poise felt like justice. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't stooped to insult. She had held her ground with dignity, and in doing so she had carried the weight of millions who knew what it was to be silenced. In the days that followed, art, poetry, and even street murals emerged celebrating the exchange. In one mural, Miller's papers fluttered to the floor while Crockett stood tall with a glowing mic in her hand, not a literal mic, but a symbol of her voice amplified across the nation. And through it all, Miller's silence remained. The man who prided himself on never being out-talked had become the face of being outclassed. The smug strategist who built his career on controlling narratives had been undone by a woman who refused to surrender hers. The applause that began in that chamber had spilled far beyond its walls. It became laughter online, cheers in living rooms, and whispers of hope in communities that rarely felt heard. Crockett had not only silenced a man, she had given voice to a movement. But beyond the viral fame, the deeper meaning of this clash would echo louder. When the noise of the memes and headlines settled, Jasmine Crockett didn't treat the moment as a personal victory. She reframed it as something bigger, something more profound. To her, it wasn't about embarrassing Stephen Miller. It was about proving that truth, spoken calmly and with conviction, could silence arrogance in a way no shouting match ever could. She reminded people that democracy isn't supposed to be a gladiator's arena where the loudest wins. It's meant to be a shared table where voices matter equally, where dignity outlasts dominance. Crockett's composure turned what could have been just another viral skirmish into a lesson about the kind of leadership America needs, not the clever quip, not the smug takedown, but the grounded truth that commands respect without demanding it. Her message spread not just through clips but through reflection. Community organizers repeated her words at rallies. Parents told their children, "See, you don't have to scream to be strong." Even pastors wove the story into sermons, framing it as a modern parable of how light outshines darkness without needing to shout. And Crockett herself, in interviews afterward, carried the theme forward. She said, "I didn't come to Congress to win arguments. I came to represent people who don't always get heard. If my silence could carry more weight than his shouting, then that's what democracy looks like." It resonated because it felt universal. Everyone knew what it meant to be talked over, dismissed, or underestimated. Everyone knew what it was to feel small in the face of someone wielding power or privilege. Crockett had lived that reality, and in that chamber she had transformed it, not just for herself but for millions watching. The lesson lingered. In an age where politics often feels like endless noise, where shouting fills the airwaves and bluster dominates headlines, sometimes the most powerful act is restraint. Sometimes silence, when it follows undeniable truth, echoes louder than the most aggressive speech. It was more than a shutdown, it was a reframing of power. Miller's brand of dominance, rooted in intimidation and cold intellect, crumbled because Crockett showed another way, a politics grounded in respect, justice, and service. Her dignity became its own form of resistance, and that resistance carried a moral weight his arrogance could not withstand. That's why the moment stuck. It wasn't just about one exchange, one silence, one smirk erased from a man's face. It was about a turning point in how people saw the possibility of politics itself, not as a theater of cruelty but as a forum where truth could, at least sometimes, still prevail. And that's why this wasn't just a shutdown, it was a turning point. Stephen Miller tried to outsmart Jasmine Crockett. He came armed with notes, with condescension, with the belief that his intellect could overwhelm her resolve. But what happened instead was silence, not her silence but his, because when Crockett answered calm and precise, the smirk slipped away, the power dynamic shifted, and the room, the audience, the nation felt it. This was more than a clash of personalities, it was a moral reminder: dignity will always outlast arrogance, calm will always pierce through chaos, and truth, when spoken with clarity, carries a weight no amount of bluster can erase. Crockett's composure didn't just silence Miller in that moment, it offered a vision of what leadership can look like: not domination, not intimidation, but representation rooted in service and respect. That's the kind of politics millions are hungry for. And now the question comes to you. If you believe truth still matters in America, share the story, spread it beyond your feed, subscribe for more battles that reveal the fault lines of power and the moments when dignity triumphs over arrogance. Every click, every share is part of amplifying the voices too often dismissed, the voices that speak not for themselves alone but for communities and generations. Because history doesn't always remember the noise, it doesn't always remember the loudest or the cruelest. What it does remember are the moments of clarity that cut through the fog, the moments when arrogance faltered and dignity stood tall. And that's why this story matters, because sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one history remembers.